They said it plainly enough for her to hear, right there on the church steps, with the whole of Verdigris Basin filing out into the noon sun around them. And Margaret Ashby had learned long ago that Cyrus timed his cruelties for exactly this kind of audience. No man in his right mind takes on a barren widow past 30, whatever land she's sitting on, Cyrus said to the two men beside him, pitched just loud enough to carry, his voice thick with the false regret of a man who wanted witnesses to his reluctant honesty. Thomas's own brother saying it pains me, but somebody's got to talk sense before the whole county wastes more sympathy on a lost cause than it's owed. Margaret kept her spine straight and her eyes on the dusty road ahead, because she had promised herself, walking up these same steps an hour before, that she would not give Cyrus Ashby the satisfaction of watching her flinch. Not here. Not in front of a congregation that had already spent 2 years watching him work his slow campaign against her. 3 years I've kept that homestead running since Thomas passed, she said, not turning. And I'll thank you to let the land itself answer whether I'm a lost cause, Cyrus, rather than your opinion of my womb. A gasp went through the small knot of women near the steps, more scandalized by her plain speech than by his cruelty, which told her everything she needed to know about which of them Verdigris Basin considered the greater sinner. Cyrus only smiled, unbothered, a man who had learned that respectability wore better armor than honesty ever could. Coarse talk for a lady asking the county's patience, he said. I only mean to spare you further disappointment, Margaret. The will's plain enough. Thomas's land reverts to Ashby kin if there's no child of the marriage living by the 4th anniversary of his passing, and that anniversary's 4 months off now. I'd hate to see you turned off the place in winter, is all, when a decent sale now would see you comfortable the rest of your days. The land is mine to hold until that date arrives and not a day before, Margaret said, and I'll spend those 4 months exactly as I've spent the 3 years prior, working it honestly, whatever you'd prefer to call my prospects. She walked home alone that afternoon along the dry basin road, past the modest spread Thomas had built with his own hands, and she had kept alive with hers since his fever took him, and let herself feel, once she was safely behind her own door, the full weight of what 4 months truly meant. She had turned 38 that spring. She had buried, along with Thomas, any illusion that some late miracle of childbearing might rescue her from the clause his father's lawyer had written into that will 30 years before, meant originally to keep Ashby land from passing to strangers, never imagined by anyone at the time to become the instrument of a grieving widow's eviction by her own brother-in-law's greed. She and Thomas had wanted children badly in the 4 years of their marriage before the fever took him, and had grieved together, quietly, each season that passed without one, never once blaming the other for a sorrow neither of them had caused. It was a private grief, born privately, and Margaret had thought, in her widowhood, that she had made her peace with it as much as any woman could. She had not accounted for a world that would take that same private sorrow and turn it into public currency, a word men like Cyrus could fling at her in a churchyard to make her prospects sound like a verdict, rather than simply a fact of her life. She had already wept over more than anyone in Verdigris Basin would ever know. She had wept for the children she and Thomas never had. She had not expected, 3 years past his death, to weep again over a county's cruel use of that same old grief as a weapon against her home. The 3 years since Thomas's passing had taught her a harder arithmetic besides, which neighbors would lend a hand at branding time without being asked twice, and which would only offer sympathy dressed up as concern, while quietly hoping she'd tire of the struggle and sell. Mrs. Halloran from the next section overbrought her preserves each autumn with a look of pity Margaret had learned to endure without flinching. The particular pity reserved for women the town had already decided were finished, however many years they had left to prove otherwise. She did not know, walking that road, that Vernon Stallworth had watched the whole ugly scene from the shade of the churchyard oak, arms crossed, saying nothing at the time because he had learned, in 41 years of life and considerable wealth, that a public argument rarely served the person, a man meant to defend so much as it served his own vanity in defending her. He had watched Margaret Ashby hold her ground against Cyrus's practiced cruelty with a steadiness that struck him harder than any beauty could have, and he rode out to the Ashby homestead himself that same evening, not to call on her, that would come later, and properly, but to look over the fence line and the modest, well-tended fields beyond it, and to think, for the better part of an hour in his saddle, about a woman he had known only slightly before Thomas's death and had watched, from a respectful distance since, manage alone what many a married couple struggled to manage together. Vernon Stallworth owned more grazing land than any 3 ranchers in the basin combined, had buried a young wife of his own to fever a decade before, and never remarried, not for want of willing candidates, but because he had grown particular, in his solitude, about what kind of woman was worth the trouble of a second courtship. He had watched Margaret Ashby at church suppers and county fairs for 3 years, noted the quality of her preserves and the straightness of her fence rows, and the plain, unfussy way she carried herself among neighbors who did not always deserve her patience, and had told himself, each time, that it was not yet his place to say so. He decided, riding home past her fence that evening with Cyrus's words still ringing distastefully in his memory, that it was past time to stop waiting for a place that would never announce itself plainly, and to make one instead. He called on her 3 days later, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon with no particular pretext beyond wanting, he said plainly at her door, to ask after her wheat, since his own hands had finished the Stallworth harvest early that year, and he found himself with time on his hands he'd rather not waste in idleness. "You've no need of my wheat's condition, Mr. Stallworth," Margaret said, though she let him in, because refusing the wealthiest rancher in the basin, a moment's hospitality struck her as a foolishness she couldn't presently afford, whatever her suspicions about his purpose. "I expect you've heard the whole county's opinion of my prospects by now, same as everyone else has." "I've heard Cyrus Ashby's opinion, which I take to be worth considerably less than the county's, given the man spent 2 years angling for your land under cover of family concern," Vernon said, settling his hat on his knee with the unhurried ease of a man used to being welcome wherever he went, though he took none of that welcome for granted here. "I came to ask after your wheat because I was curious whether the woman managing a homestead alone for 3 years running had done it as capably as I suspected, and because I found I wanted an excuse to sit at your table a while, if you'll permit one." She studied him a long moment across her own kitchen, this broad, plain-spoken man who owned half the grazing land in Verdigris Basin, and had never, in 3 years of her widowhood, treated her with anything but a distant, unassuming courtesy that she had assumed, until this moment, was simply his manner with everyone. "You'll find my wheat's thin this year, same as everyone's basin-wide, and my prospects thinner still, if Cyrus has his way of it come spring." "Cyrus won't have his way of it," Vernon said, with a plain certainty that surprised her more than any flattery could have. "Not while I've got breath and standing enough in this county to say otherwise." He had reason, within the month, to make good on that promise sooner than either of them expected. Cyrus, sensing perhaps that his practiced patience had begun to lose its hold now that Vernon Stallworth had taken an open interest, moved against Margaret's livelihood directly, quietly persuading the grain buyer at Cross Timbers, who handled most of the basin's wheat, that a widow soon to lose her claim, Was a poor risk worth passing over in favor of steadier custom? The buyer, a cautious man with no wish to offend an Ashby, sent word that autumn that he could not take Margaret's harvest that season after all, leaving her with a full crop cut and threshed, and nowhere honest to sell it before winter set hard enough to spoil it in the barn. She rode to Vernon spread the same evening she learned of it, too proud to ask outright for help and too practical to pretend the trouble away, and found herself, despite her pride, telling him the whole of it before she'd finished her coffee at his kitchen table. Cyrus thinks to starve you out before the anniversary even arrives, so the clause needn't even be tested, Vernon said, listening with the same stillness he brought to every trouble she laid before him. He'll find that harder than he expects. I ship twice what cross timbers wants of my own stock to the rail depot at Larkin every autumn, and I've standing enough with 3 buyers there who take your wheat gladly at a fair price, Cyrus Ashby's opinion notwithstanding. He said it plainly, without the swagger of a man making a grand gesture. In the same tone he might have used to remark on the weather, and Margaret understood, watching him, that this was simply how Vernon Stallworth solved problems, not with declarations, but with the quiet application of resources he'd spent a lifetime accumulating, and had apparently been waiting, without quite knowing it, for a reason worth spending them on. Her wheat sold that November at a fair price to a Larkin buyer, who asked no questions about her prospects at all, only about the grain's quality, and Margaret allowed herself, for the first time in 3 years, the small satisfaction of watching one of Cyrus's schemes fail entirely for want of the isolation he'd counted on. The weeks that followed built themselves slowly, the way courtship builds itself between 2 people old enough to have learned patience the hard way. Vernon came by with reasons that grew steadily thinner as the excuse for wheat talk wore out, a fence needing mending along a boundary they didn't in fact share, a query about her preserves for a church supper he hadn't been asked to organize, until at last he stopped pretending reasons were necessary at all, and simply came, of an evening, to sit on her porch and talk of ordinary things. His late wife, whom he spoke of gently and without the guardedness of a man still grieving. The daughter he'd never had and sometimes wished for. The particular loneliness of managing a fortune with no one to share the managing of it. "You're not what the county expected me to want, Margaret," he told her one such evening, watching the basin go gold and then gray in the last of the light. "I expect half of Verdigris has been waiting years for me to court some young beauty fresh off the stage from the East. I find I've got no use for that particular expectation." "And what use have you for a barren widow past her prime, then, Vernon?" She said it plainly, testing him, wanting to see whether the word would catch in his throat the way it caught in every other man's. "I've use for a woman who kept a homestead running alone through 3 hard years, and never once asked the county for pity while she did it," he said, unhurried, unbothered by the word she'd thrown at him like a challenge. "I've use for a woman whose company I've come to want more than my own solitude, which is saying considerably more than you might think, given how comfortably I've managed that solitude the last 10 years. Whatever the county calls barren, Margaret, I call none of my business and less of my concern. I'm not courting a womb, I'm courting you." She did not know, hearing it, whether to weep or to laugh at the plain relief of finally being seen the way she'd stopped believing any man would trouble to see her, and settled in the end, for simply letting her hand rest in his on the porch rail a moment longer than propriety strictly required, which said, she thought, everything she couldn't yet trust herself to say aloud. Vernon's own circle was not entirely spared its share of doubting whispers, though his standing in the basin made them considerably quieter than the talk aimed at Margaret. His old friend Judge Halbrook, sharing a drink with him after a cattlemen's meeting that November, ventured to ask, with the careful delicacy of a man who considered himself Vernon's well-wisher, whether he'd given full thought to a marriage that would leave him without an heir of his own blood, given Margaret's years and her circumstances both. "I had a wife once who gave me no child either, Halbrook, and I never once loved her the less for it, nor considered our marriage some lesser bargain for the lack," Vernon said, and something in his voice closed the subject more firmly than any raised temper could have. "I'll thank you and every other man in this county to leave off counting what a woman owes a marriage and children, and start counting instead what she brings to it in character, which is a good deal harder to breed for, and worth considerably more once you've found it. Margaret Ashby has more of that than any woman I've met in 10 years of looking, whether I was rightly looking or not. I don't intend to let this county's arithmetic talk me out of the first thing I've wanted for myself since I buried my Ellen." Halbrook, chastened, said no more on the subject, and word of Vernon's answer made its own quiet way around the basin's more respectable parlors within the week, softening, if only slightly, the ground beneath Margaret's feet before the harder test of December ever arrived. At the church harvest supper that same month, Vernon walked in at her side rather than arriving separately as propriety might have suggested, and stood beside her through an hour of stilted, curious conversation, with a calm that told the whole room, more plainly than any announcement could have, exactly where his loyalties had settled. "You didn't have to make such a show of it tonight," Margaret told him afterward, walking to his wagon under a sky gone thick with early winter stars. "Wasn't a show," he said. "A show is what a man puts on to convince a room of something he doesn't believe himself. I only stood where I meant to stand, Margaret, same as I intend to keep standing, church supper, or land office, or wherever else this county needs reminding of it." Cyrus did not take the courtship quietly. He had counted, these 3 years, on Margaret's isolation as much as on the will's clause, understanding that a widow with no allies and no prospects was a widow who would eventually tire of the fight and sell cheap, rather than face eviction in winter with nowhere else to go. And Vernon Stallworth's open courtship threatened that calculation more thoroughly than anything else could have. He came to her door again within the month, all false gentleness stripped away this time, replaced by the plain threat of a man who saw his long patience running out. "You do well to remember, Margaret, that Stallworth's interest changes nothing about the will's terms," he said. "The land reverts to Ashby kin if there's no child of the marriage living by the anniversary, full stop, whatever rich friend you've acquired to console you meantime. I'd think carefully before you let a rancher's attentions give you false comfort about a debt only blood can settle. The will says child of the marriage, Cyrus. It says nothing of what happens should I remarry before that date arrives," Margaret said, though she had, in fact, spent several sleepless nights turning over the exact language of that old clause herself, uncertain whether her reading of it would hold against a lawyer Cyrus could afford, and she could not. "A technicality my own lawyer will happily argue away, should it come to that," Cyrus said. "I'd not stake your home on a technicality if I were you." He left her with that threat hanging in the doorway, and Margaret spent the better part of that night at her kitchen table with Thomas's old will spread before her by lamplight, reading and rereading language she had once trusted, and now found herself desperately parsing for loopholes. A grieving widow 3 years past her husband's death had never thought she would need to hunt for. The lamplight fell across the same table where she and Thomas had once planned the additions they meant to build onto the house should a family ever come to fill it, additions that had never been built, and she found the old grief and the new fear tangling together that night in a way that left her, by the small hours, uncertain which one she was truly weeping over. She thought of writing to her own sister in the next territory over, to ask whether she ought simply to accept defeat and go live out her remaining years as a dependent aunt in someone else's household, and got as far as dipping the pen before pride, or something steadier than pride, stopped her hand and set it back in its stand. She had not spent 3 years proving Cyrus wrong about her capability, only to write herself off as a burden the very night his lawyer's cleverness frightened her. She folded the will away before dawn, resolved to fight the clause on whatever ground the law allowed her, and told no one, not even Vernon, how close that lamplit night had brought her to giving up the fight entirely. She told Vernon of it the following evening, laying out her fear plainly rather than let pride keep her silent the way it might have 3 years before, when she had still believed silence was a widow's proper armor. He means to have his lawyer argue the clause covers me regardless of remarriage, and I confess, I don't know the law well enough to say for certain he's wrong. I won't have you tangled in a legal fight over land that may not even be worth the fighting for, Vernon, when you've fortune enough of your own without troubling over mine. I've already sent across timbers for the best land lawyer money in this basin can hire, Vernon said, and something in the calm, already settled certainty of it told her he had anticipated Cyrus's move before she'd even finished describing it. I didn't wait for your permission on that, Margaret, and I'll ask your pardon for the presumption. But I've watched Cyrus Ashby maneuver against you for 3 years now, and I'll not stand by while he tries once more, technicality or otherwise. Let him bring his lawyer. I'll bring mine, and mine's argued water rights against 3 railroads and won every time. The county land office scheduled the formal hearing for the second week of December, at Cyrus's own insistence, timed deliberately to fall before the anniversary itself, so that Margaret might be turned off the property with enough winter left to make her leaving as hard as possible. And word of the dispute spread through Verdigris Basin, with the particular relish small counties, reserved for a rich man's private business, turned suddenly, deliciously public. The whole basin turned out that December morning to crowd the land office's modest hearing room, farmers and ranchers and gossiping wives alike, drawn by the promise of watching Cyrus Ashby's long campaign against his brother's widow, finally settled one way or the other in front of witnesses. Cyrus's lawyer argued precisely what Cyrus had threatened, that the reversion clause bound to childlessness regardless of any subsequent marriage, that the land's original purpose was to keep Ashby holdings from passing permanently outside Ashby blood, and that Margaret's remarriage, however imminent, changed nothing of the plain letter of old Ashby Sr.'s intent. He spoke a long while, confident, watching Margaret across the crowded room, with the particular satisfaction of a man who believed he had already won, citing the will's exact wording twice over, and reminding the judge, with an unctuous little bow, that the county's respect for a founding family's clear intentions ought to outweigh whatever sympathy the room might feel for a widow's hard circumstances. Vernon's lawyer, a spare, unhurried man from cross timbers who had indeed argued water rights against 3 railroads and won, countered that the clause's plain purpose, keeping the land within the family that had built it, was in no way served by evicting the very woman who had kept that land productive and intact for 3 years running, and called, to the room's evident surprise, both Mrs. Halloran and the Larkin grain buyer to speak briefly to Margaret's careful stewardship of the homestead. Testimony that did more, Margaret suspected, to sway the room's sympathy than any point of law either side had yet raised. Mrs. Halloran, who had brought her pitying preserves each autumn without ever quite believing Margaret would prevail, surprised herself as much as anyone by speaking with unexpected warmth of a neighbor who had never once, in 3 hard years, asked for more help than she gave back tenfold at harvest time. Might I address the room before counsel concludes? Vernon rose from beside Margaret when his own lawyer finished a rebuttal that had left the county judge visibly weighing both arguments without clear favor, and the room's murmur quieted at the sight of the basin's wealthiest rancher, standing to speak on a widow's behalf in open court. I'll grant Cyrus Ashby's lawyer a fine reading of an old man's intent 30 years buried, Vernon said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the crowded room. But I'd ask this room to consider a simpler point than any clause's letter. Margaret Ashby has run that homestead alone for 3 years, honestly and without complaint, while her own brother-in-law spent those same 3 years scheming how best to take it from her, rather than lifting a single hand to help her keep it. Whatever old Ashby Sr. intended by that clause, I'll wager my whole fortune he never intended it as a weapon for a grasping man to turn against a grieving widow who'd done nothing but keep faith with her husband's memory. He turned then, not to the judge, but to Margaret herself, and the whole room seemed to hold its breath at what was plainly, suddenly, no longer a matter of legal argument at all. I came here prepared to argue the letter of a will, Margaret, because I judged it the surest way to protect what's rightfully yours. I find, standing here, that I'd rather settle the matter more plainly than any lawyer can manage. He came around the table to stand before her, in front of the judge, in front of Cyrus's reddening face, in front of the whole basin crowded into that small hearing room on a cold December morning. Marry me. Not today, not this hour. If propriety requires we wait for a decent interval, but say yes to it now, in front of this room, so that whatever this county's clause intended 30 years back, it will never again have the smallest claim on a home you've earned every single day of these 3 hard years. I've watched you manage alone what most couples struggle to manage together, and I find I don't want to watch you do it alone one day longer than you have to. The room's murmur rose around them, half scandal and half wonder, and Margaret, looking up at a man who had asked her plainly, in front of the whole doubting basin, to be seen exactly as she was rather than as the label Cyrus had spent 3 years trying to fasten to her, found she had no hesitation left in her at all. Yes, she said, clear enough to carry to the back of the room, same as Cyrus's cruelty once had. Yes, Vernon Stallworth, I will. The judge, visibly relieved to have a tidy resolution handed to him, rather than a thorny 30-year-old clause to untangle, noted for the record that the impending marriage rendered the reversion question moot regardless of how the original will's language might otherwise have been construed, and adjourned the hearing to considerably more excited chatter than any land dispute in county memory had previously produced. Cyrus left the hearing room white-faced and silent, his lawyer's fine argument rendered entirely irrelevant by a proposal delivered in front of the one audience he could never again control the opinion of. The weeks between that hearing and the wedding itself passed in a strange, sweet suspension Margaret had not expected to feel again at her age, as though the whole basin's opinion of her had turned over in the space of a single December morning and left her blinking in unfamiliar sunlight. Women who had crossed the street to avoid her 3 years running now stopped to wish her joy, some with genuine warmth, and some with the transparent eagerness of neighbors who did not wish to be remembered as having doubted the wealthiest rancher's chosen bride. And Margaret found she had grace enough, in her new happiness, to accept both kinds equally without troubling to sort one from the other. Vernon came by most evenings that winter still, though the courting was formally settled now, and the whole basin knew it, because he told her plainly he saw no reason to change a habit that had brought him more contentment than a decade of solitary suppers ever had. They spoke, those long winter evenings, of practical things, how best to combine 2 working ranches without either operation suffering for the joining, what to do with the Ashby homestead once she no longer needed to defend it alone, whether Thomas's modest house might serve better as a line camp than stand empty. And Margaret found in those ordinary conversations a deeper courtship than any grand romantic gesture could have offered her, the courtship of 2 people planning, plainly and honestly, an actual shared life, rather than merely a wedding day. They married the following spring, once decency's interval had passed, in the same small basin church where Cyrus had once pronounced her a lost cause on the steps for half the congregation to hear. And Margaret walked down that aisle past many of the same faces that had gasped at her plain speech in the churchyard 8 months before, now smiling with the particular warmth of people who had come around, in their own slow way, to admiring precisely what they had once been quick to dismiss. Cyrus did not attend. He left Verdigris Basin within the year, his standing in the county thoroughly diminished by a hearing that had exposed, in front of everyone who mattered, exactly what his 3 years of concern for Margaret's welfare had truly amounted to. And Margaret found she felt no triumph in his leaving, only the quiet, unburdened relief of a woman who no longer had to measure each season against a stranger's greed. She heard, years later, that he had settled 2 counties over and made a poor showing of the small holding he'd scraped together there, and found she felt nothing at all on hearing it, neither satisfaction nor pity, only the mild indifference a woman feels toward whether that has finally passed her by for good. Margaret kept the Ashby homestead standing rather than let it fall to a line camp after all, once she and Vernon had settled the practical matter of it, and turned it instead into a small dower house, where, in later years, young brides new to the basin came to ask her advice on wheat and weather, and the particular loneliness of a first hard winter far from their mothers. And Margaret gave that advice as generously as she'd once wished someone had given it to her, remembering always the 3 years she had managed those same lessons alone, with no one troubling to teach her any of them kindly. She thought sometimes, in the easy years that followed, of the words Cyrus had thrown at her on those church steps, meaning it as a wound, and marveled at how thoroughly it had lost its power to cut her once a man worth the name had looked at her plainly, and called it nothing at all, no more relevant to her worth than the color of her hair, or the number of harvests she'd brought in alone. She had spent 38 years believing herself measured, in the end, by what she could not give a man. It had taken one plain-spoken rancher, standing up in a crowded hearing room in front of the whole doubting county, to teach her that the only measure that had ever truly mattered was the one Vernon Stallworth gave her freely, every single ordinary evening after, over supper and over hard seasons, and over the small, accumulating tenderness of a life well and fully shared. That she was, exactly as she stood, entirely and sufficiently enough, and had been all along, whatever the county's cruel arithmetic had once tried to tell her.